In my last video, I compared a budget condenser microphone to an AKG C414, which I felt it may have been inspired by, and I threw a Sennheiser MD421 into the mix to make it more fun. And since then, it's not even been 24 hours yet, and already over 300 people have voted in the poll that I left linked to the video, and many people commented on that video giving their opinions on which they thought was which. Now I can reveal the answers now. I think 300 votes is enough, and a lot of people were eager to find out the correct answers. So A was the budget studio condenser microphone, the TakStar TAK55. B was the original AKG C414, and C was the Sennheiser MD421. Now, it seemed that there was quite a few experienced engineers in the comments who were able to reason their way to the correct answers by knowing what to listen for. Now, it's not that difficult to hear the differences if you know what to listen for, but if you don't know what to listen for, that maybe all of them sound the same. And many people in the comments actually said they all sound the same and they can't tell the difference. I can hear quite a significant difference between all three microphones, and I'll tell you now what to listen for. So, as some people correctly identified in the comments, many of these budget studio condensers, especially the Chinese ones, they have a bump in the higher frequencies around 10K or something to make them sound more airy or higher fidelity or whatever, or more impressive. Especially for less experienced people, they want to be wowed by a new condenser microphone. They want to plug it in and be like, wow, it's so high resolution. I can hear every detail. It's got such a higher sheen, amazing higher end that I can hear all of the nuances of the music. So that's why they give it a bump in the higher frequencies, and to give it more of that high res sound or whatever that you might expect from a condenser microphone. Whereas an actual professional condenser microphone maybe is a bit more laid back in the higher frequencies, and an AKG C414 is actually famous for being not that hyped in the top end and a bit more neutral. It's a very neutral sounding microphone, and actually when you compare the two, you might be like, oh, it actually sounds boring in comparison. It sounds like it's too dull or something. It's like missing top end. But actually, that is the sound of a more professional condenser microphone, is that it's not exaggerated in the higher frequencies. It's a bit more neutral. And then the dynamic microphone, the sound signature of that is a big colored sound with a big peak in the mids, and it really cuts through the mix often, especially on acoustic guitar. It's actually my favorite microphone for recording acoustic guitar for rock tracks because it just cuts through so well, and I'm going to demonstrate that in a second. Now, like I mentioned in my previous video, it's not necessarily that one is way better, it's just about what sound you want for the thing that you're recording. Now, when I'm using the 414, I generally tend to have to make that sound less warm in the mix because it's so warm, it's just muffled in the mix, so you need to deal with that with EQ. But whereas something like the TakStar TAK55, it's got more of a hyped high end. Maybe you need to use less EQ, or maybe you could just use it how it is, even without using the EQ, because it has got more of a tonality that might suit the end sound in a mix rather than having to be necessarily EQ'd. That said, a lot of people did identify the 414 and say, yeah, it does have a more sort of nuanced, more mature, more, I don't know, finer sound. It just sounds like you could really hear that the vocal sounded more intimate and stuff like that. But generally speaking, going off of the comments, a lot of people did actually prefer the TAK and actually thought that that was the 414. Now, the poll results are really interesting. The first question was, what one do you think is the 414? And most people did correctly identify the 414 as being microphone B. However, it was fairly close between A and B. It seems like most people knew that C wasn't the 414. It was probably between A and B. But a lot of people also thought that it could have been A. It was quite tight there. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because for the next question, I asked people which one was the TakStar TAK55 microphone. And most people actually voted for C. So I think what was happening there was people were like, yeah, well, A and B sound kind of similar, and C sounds kind of weird with a weird tonality, and it sounds more different than the other two. So I'm guessing that's the TakStar because it's the cheap one, so it doesn't sound as good or something. It sounds weird, so you get what you pay for, and it was cheap, so that was that one. I think that was what people were thinking. But actually, no. the C sounded weird because it's a dynamic microphone, and dynamics have big coloration and they're not as true to the original signal. Whereas A and B are way more true to the original signal, and the way that you can tell apart A and B is because the TakStar is more hyped in the top end, so you can hear on the pick noise and stuff, you can hear that is the TakStar is A. But out of A and B, they're actually remarkably similar, and many people commented that they were very similar, or even that they couldn't tell the difference between them. If you listen to the pick noise, you can really hear the difference. Unless maybe your hearing doesn't really allow you to hear those high frequencies. Some older people commented that they couldn't hear the differences between all three of them. And in that case, maybe you won't hear that difference. But if you are able to hear 10, 12K and you listen for the pick noise, it is a bit of a giveaway between the TakStar and the 414. But the real different sound came because it was a dynamic microphone for C. But then the third question was the most interesting of all, because I just asked people, oh, what one do you like the best? And the majority of people actually preferred A. So the majority of people preferred the TakStar TAK-55 cheap Chinese condenser microphone. The majority preferred that. It was close between the TakStar and the AKG C414, but the TakStar actually did lead the way by 1% or so. And the minority of people actually preferred the dynamic microphone, the Sennheiser MD421. Only 12% of people preferred that microphone. Now, there's a few things to talk about here. Firstly, the kind of theme of my channel recently has been, you don't need to spend all this money on marketing hype. You can, as long as you spend a reasonable amount of money getting a decent quality product, then there's pretty much marginal differences past that point. So contrary to popular belief, I've never said, oh yeah, just get anything for €5. No, you need to spend a bit of money to get something sensible, but after some sort of sensible price point of 100, 200 quid or something like that, there's diminishing returns, and at that point, you've already got something sensible, providing it's well made. Of course, you can spend thousands of euros and still get something that sounds like crap. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the differences between well-made things for a reasonable price upwards. And we have shown here that you don't need to spend €1,000 or whatever on a more high-end condenser microphone, because most people actually prefer the sound of one that isn't that expensive. What is this one, like $100 or $150? I think you get the cut-down version from TakStar without the switches and stuff, or $50 or something. It's like you don't need to spend that much money to get a good sounding condenser microphone. The second interesting thing to note is that 88% of people who voted for the condenser microphones are actually wrong, because the Sennheiser MD421 sounds the best, and I'll prove it. Okay, I'm joking a bit here because the acoustic guitar vibe with the delicate vocals, and maybe that really did genuinely suit the condenser microphones more. But I want to make a point that people who dismissed the dynamic microphone in the comments, don't dismiss dynamic microphones so quickly. That weird coloration with the peaky mid frequencies and the weird sound that just sounds so different from the condenser microphones, that's not a bad thing. That's not a defect. That's actually one of the greatest things about dynamic microphones, that they are colored, that they do have often they have strong mid frequencies and they can cut through a mix. And that is exactly what you need for rock music when you're recording the acoustic guitar. Let's see what one cuts through the mix more.